Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. This is Sidney Holmes. In 1989, he was wrongfully convicted and spent the last 34 years in prison. Many of you who watch my videos weren't even born when this man was railroaded into prison. A lot of us were still children at the time. Prosecutors claimed that Mr. Holmes had been the driver for two unidentified men who robbed a couple at gunpoint and stole their car. The only so-called evidence that was supposed to link Mr. Holmes to the crime was a flawed photo and live identification lineup that fingered him as the suspect. Even the sheriff's deputies in Broward who did the original investigation were shocked that he had been sentenced to 400 years. Earlier this week, Mr. Holmes was finally released from prison after 34 years, and it made it into the white media online news sphere. His story has been reported on the regular online news feeds, and many of you have probably seen it. This man is nearly a senior citizen now. His youth and the majority of his life have been spent locked in a cage for something he didn't even do, and the people who put him in prison really had no excuse for doing so. We can thank the Innocence Project of Florida for having worked and fought for so long until they were able to get this innocent man freed. Now at this point, a lot of you may be saying, well, he's going to have a hell of a payout when it comes time to sue the state for compensation. Well, don't bet on that. Florida's Republican legislature has made their state law so that innocent men like Mr. Holmes can't sue the state for compensation because, in his case, he had a prior offense. That's one of the things you see a lot of these, especially red state legislatures doing, trying to do anything they can to add any sort of loopholes to make it where we can throw you in prison for 20, 30, 40 years, but you're not entitled to compensation afterwards. And you wonder why I laugh at idiots who say we ought to go vote GOP. Reports are that there's been legislation proposed that would change Florida's laws, but God only knows if that's going to happen. But what you may not be aware of is there's plenty of other stories that have happened recently just like Mr. Holmes. In fact, just 4 days before Mr. Holmes was released, another innocent black man had been released in Indiana after spending 25 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Leon Benson had been sentenced to 61 years in prison for the murder of Casey Schoen. Mr. Benson spent more than 9 years in solitary confinement. He had a daughter at the time who was 2 when he was falsely imprisoned. The murder that he had been convicted of occurred at 3:30 a.m. in near darkness. The evidence against him came down to a frightened white newspaper carrier who was standing 150 feet from where he claimed Mr. Benson was. Standing 150 feet away from the alleged gunman in near darkness? What kind of eyewitness is this? The only other witness was a man with a history of mental illness who had his own personal grudge against Mr. Benson. There was evidence withheld from Mr. Benson's defense as well, such as evidence that there had been a different killer. But of course, he's black, so that made no difference. Mr. Benson spent over half his life in prison, a fifth of his life in solitary confinement. But you probably didn't hear about this case, did you? It happened only a week ago, but didn't get much attention at all. And here's another one you probably didn't hear about. This is Sheldon Thomas. Last week, on the exact same day that Leon Benson's wrongful conviction was being vacated, in New York City, Mr. Thomas was finally being released from prison after having spent 20 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. In 2004, he was wrongfully arrested for the killing of a 14-year-old, Anderson Bursey. The wrongful conviction was based on a photo lineup. The claim is that police used the wrong photo of a different man who coincidentally had the same name. Basically, the cops decided to snatch the first Sheldon Thomas's photo that they had in their archives, and that's how this alleged accident happened. But it wasn't an accident at all, because the DA's office admitted that investigators were fully aware of their mistake during pretrial proceedings. But the authorities wanted to proceed anyway, as did the judge who said there was still probably cause to arrest Mr. Thomas based on an anonymous tip and an alleged resemblance between himself and this other man with the same name. Because all black men look alike, remember? Today, the authorities admit that Mr. Thomas was denied due process at every single stage of the process. Like when one of the detectives who arrested Sheldon was forced to admit he had committed perjury when he falsely testified that a witness had identified Mr. Thomas's photo, even though his photo hadn't been in the array at all. Perjury. Caught in court, but nothing was done about it. The judge and the prosecutors still proceeded forward with the case, even after having admitted perjury about the identification. So it wasn't just the police who went forward with a photo lineup that they knew was false, or prosecutors who chose to continue with the case knowing the only alleged proof was false, but also a judge who knew all of this, and still wanted to proceed to convict this man anyway. This man has been incarcerated since he was at least 17 years old. Most 17-year-olds are seniors or even juniors in high school. They're trying to figure out what they're going to be doing with their lives after they graduate, what kind of college they're going to, trade school. Some of them are wondering about marrying their own high school sweetheart. Mr. Thomas was arrested, put on trial with false evidence, and had his childhood and much of his adulthood robbed from him by people who knew that there was no case against him. February 15, 2023, less than a month ago in Missouri, Lamar Johnson was released after having spent 27 years in prison. He had been convicted in 1995 for a murder he didn't commit. Mr. Johnson had an alibi, and there was no physical evidence to link him to the crime at all, but prosecutors went ahead anyway, based entirely on a single alleged eyewitness. That eyewitness has since admitted that he felt pressured by the authorities to pick someone out of the photo lineup. He also admitted that prosecutors paid him more than $4,000 in witness compensation before the trial, a fact that prosecutors conveniently decided not to disclose to the defense at the time of the proceedings. Prosecutors also decided to withhold evidence that would have undermined their so-called eyewitness's testimony. The sole eyewitness the police had recanted his own testimony. Eventually, 2 other men confessed to the crime, but Mr. Johnson spent nearly 3 decades locked in prison because of that. The crooked prosecutors who framed Mr. Johnson claimed 4 years ago that any accusations of prosecutorial misconduct were outlandish. Well, today we know the accusations are true. Mr. Johnson owes his freedom to the Midwest Innocence Project. But they say that Mr. Johnson isn't eligible for any compensation under that state's law. They've since set up a GoFundMe, which so far has collected over $500,000. But the reality is Mr. Johnson is entitled to millions. But as the exonerations have begun to pile up, we see all number of states enacting laws meant to limit, if not outright eliminate, compensation for the black people who have been wrongfully convicted. Now, these 4 cases I just told you about were all within the last 30 days. This is just what's happened in the last 4 weeks. That's all, not the last 4 years, or even the last 4 months, or even the last 2 months. These 4 cases were just what's happened in the last 30 days. We have a lot of white supremacists who think that they're going to win a war against black people by cutting and pasting phony baloney crime stats. Their numbers are usually fake as a $3 bill, but even if you take their word at gospel truth, it still falls flat. We hear that black people commit the majority of crimes in America. Not true. And we know it's not true because black people make up the vast majority of wrongfully convicted people in America. Notice how that little detail never makes it into the white supremacist talking points. The University of California in Irvine, the University of Michigan Law School, and Michigan State University College of Law compiled a report on race and wrongful conviction for 2022. They reported that black people are 13% of the population, but 53% of those exonerated. 13% of the population, but over half of the people wrongfully convicted. Next time some half-cocked white supremacist tries to claim that black people commit over 50% of the homicides, you remind them that we're also over 50% of those wrongfully convicted, too. I'm sure you notice the one-to-one correlation. Black people are also 7 times more likely than white people to be falsely convicted. At the group level, overwhelmingly likely to be deliberately framed and convicted of fabricated drug crimes in large-scale police scandals. This is where the all-in laws come in. And unlike Heather McDonald's fraudulent made-up stats, these are easy to read and understand. This is why liars like her and Charles Murray are never mentioned in actual universities, and instead they're banished to the right-wing toilet of Fox News and right-wing hate radio. No academic can take them seriously because the facts are already well known. And remember, this report basically talks about merely the exonerations that have been detected and actually adjudicated. There's a huge number of black people who have been wrongfully convicted but never released. Kamala Harris did her part to keep innocent people in prison when she was Attorney General of California. Now, what needs to be also kept in mind is that the white media is neck deep in this racial persecution. When they report on these men who have been let out of prison, almost all their stories mention the sentence that these men got, but almost none of them put the words wrongfully convicted in the headline or even the body of their articles. And I had to dang near treasure hunt just to find some headlines that did bother to actually put the words wrongfully convicted in the headlines when talking about these men. Go ahead and do a Google search for yourself. You'll find that wrongfully convicted in the headline is the exception, not the rule. The first thing that people need to know about these men is not how long they spent in prison, but the fact that they were in prison wrongfully. That's what you lead with. You don't lead with the length of the sentence, you lead with the fact that these are innocent men. But the white media doesn't do that. That's deliberate. This is done to make it clear that these men were merely released, but that doesn't mean that they're innocent. And so the racist liars like Ben Shapiro, and Heather McDonald with her fiction book The War on Cops can keep claiming lies about their made-up crime stats. The white media gives them cover to do so. We can also thank Joe Biden for this. His 1994 crime bill, or Biden's law as he called it back then, is a large part of why this happened, turbocharging the prison industrial complex. The so-called truth in sentencing provision in Biden's 94 crime bill gave billions of dollars to the states, but in order to get the money, the states first had to change their own laws and bring them in line with Biden's draconian racist standards at the federal level. Biden learned that little trick from those white racist segregationists who he was mentored by in the 60s and 70s, like Senator Eastland and Strom Thurmond. They taught him how to weaponize the federal budget to incentivize states to enact measures meant to attack black people. And that's exactly what Biden did. These wrongful convictions are not happening because of small technicalities. They're not happening because the police and prosecutors and judges have no idea these cases are false. They're happening exactly because they know the cases are false. It's happening because these criminals with badges and law degrees are allowed to railroad innocent black men into prison, and they never get punished. Those are the laws that we need. Any court apparatus that systematically locks people up on evidence they know to be false is not a judicial system. It is a prejudicial system. For those linguistic types out there, you know the word prejudice means to prejudge. And when we get harassed and persecuted by the injustice system, we are already prejudged before we walk into the courtroom. Merely being arrested is 85% of what it takes to convict a black person. And then you have courts that refuse to obey the law or even common decency. I can't say that they refuse to correct their mistake because they didn't make a mistake. They understand exactly what their job is, even if most black people don't. Their job is not to incarcerate the guilty. Their job is to persecute black people. When you see black people locked up for decades on no evidence, with the authorities knowing full well they're innocent, those are not mistakes by the system. That's the system working exactly the way it was designed. The people operating the system know exactly what their job is, and they also know that there's no chance they're going to get punished for having destroyed a black person's life. This happens all the time. The white media will show you one story but then bury the rest of them. I just gave you a peek at what's been going on in the last 4 weeks alone. If these were white men that this was happening to, there would already have been laws in the books a long time ago, and they would have vastly expanded compensation for them no matter what. Mike Nifong merely prosecuted some white men, and not only did he lose his law license, he lost his freedom as well. And the Duke lacrosse players, they didn't even spend a moment in prison. They never got convicted because the right-wing hate machine swung into action the moment they heard that these white defendants were being prosecuted for allegedly raping a black woman. They heard that and they went on the warpath to keep them out of prison. Same way we see Juju Chang going to the mat to get convicted serial rapist Daniel Holtzclaw out of prison, even though she knows full well he's guilty as hell. The principle of racial immunity from law must be maintained, and if someone goes to prison for harming a black person, well, that sets the wrong precedent. But the Duke lacrosse players did not lose anything. Nothing happened to them. They didn't spend any time in prison. Linda Fairstein, the now disgraced former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney, she was the one who wrongfully prosecuted the Central Park Five, and not only is she not in prison, she still has her law license. This is not happening because of lack of money. White defendants who don't have any money don't get incarcerated, certainly not at the same rate as black defendants. I've detailed for you for years now how even with violent offenses on their records, some people are allowed to have genetic immunity from law. And this isn't happening because of class either. It's happening strictly because of race. The prisons are used as a means of racial control, not for actual crimes, but as a reminder that black people can be capriciously snatched off the streets at any moment, accused of something with absolutely no proof. The police can admit in court that they lied through their teeth about it. You can have a rock-solid alibi, and it still won't matter because you live under a system of anti-black racism. The guilty people are the trash who carry out these state-sanctioned kidnappings and false imprisonments. Also the white media who tries to conceal it with misleading headlines and never making a crusade out of putting away the police and prosecutors and judges who do this. They never make a crusade out of making it harder to convict innocent people of crimes they didn't commit and making it easier to get proper compensation when it happens. The white media doesn't tell people how often this occurs because then people would ask questions about the police, the DAs, and the judges. And white power doesn't want that. They'd also ask why the white media's investigations never seem to find these obvious false convictions. All these white networks and big newspapers, they've got investigators of their own. They have resources of their own to look into these cases, and yet they're not. They're not the ones uncovering all these wrongful convictions. Instead, it's kids in law school who are doing the job of looking for the truth, and they're finding it. Each one of these cases I just told you about was the result of some law students and a few decent people like the Innocence Project who put in the time and resources to prove these black people's innocence. It wasn't the government and certainly wasn't the white media. The United States has more people behind bars than any other country on earth. More people behind bars than China, which has 6 times the population of the U.S., more than India, more than so-called despotic regimes like Iran, more than North Korea. There's more people incarcerated in the United States than in Putin's gulags in Russia. Think about that. So I ask you, who's the police state? Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Shrampstein, Arlaz, Rowan Wings, Jeffrey Williams, and Suleiman Alaji. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.